I'm very glad to greet you at this meeting. This is the second meeting of the cycle of interviews and lectures, Perspectives of Ukrainian Cinema, and it is conducted on the basis of the Laboratory of Cinema and Philosophy Research of the Nova Institute of Philosophy. Our meeting today is devoted to a significant topic: the women's role in Ukrainian society, in Ukrainian culture, and in Ukrainian military, and for sure their resistance against the Russian occupation. Moreover, we will also address the representation of women at war in Ukrainian documentary films. Together with our guest, Tamara Martsenyuk, we would discuss how the evolution of cultural representations of female combatants led to structural changes in Ukrainian society, and what role social and artistic projects had in this transformation. I would like to present Tamara Martsenyuk. She holds a Ph.D. in Sociology, and she is an associate professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Social Technologies of the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Recently, Tamara was a Fulbright Scholar at Columbia University, DAAD Visiting Professor, and Petro Yacyk Fellow. Tamara's main research interest lies in the field of the sociology of gender. In 2015, Tamara joined a Ukrainian advocacy campaign and a civil rights project for gender equality in the armed forces of Ukraine, the Invisible Battalion, as an academic coordinator of this project and the sociological research that was conducted within it. In her recent books, Defenders of the Galaxy, The Power and Crisis in the Male World, Gender for All, A Challenge to Stereotypes, and Why Not Be Afraid of Feminism, Tamara shares her academic research with a wide audience. I'm very grateful, Tamara, for taking the time and joining our meeting today. And I suggest starting our talk with providing a context of the gender discourse in Ukraine and how it was transformed in recent years, especially referring to the military sphere. It is a well-known fact that women have long been underestimated in Ukrainian public space, in different spheres of it because of the gender discrimination. Even though we know a lot of instances when women played a remarkable role in Ukrainian history, society, culture, they were predominantly perceived as those who would not intervene in social processes and have a direct impact on social change. However, men have been viewed as social agents who shape the social realm. Specifically, if we consider the realm of armed resistance, where men were associated and still are associated with the main fighters. It is true that in liminal periods of Ukrainian history, men were perceived and even nowadays are perceived as warriors, for instance, they may be perceived as Cossacks whose duty was to defend the state. But if we consider the history, indeed, several centuries ago, Cossacks were men only. But nowadays, this image of only male resistance and oppressed female nation are no more relevant. Today, men and women have equal constitutional rights and liberties in our country. Women were active participants in the Revolution of Dignity, then they joined the armed forces after the Russian occupation, and taking into account current statistics, women represent 20% of our military forces, whereas more than half of Ukrainian women reported being ready to join the Ukrainian army. In this context, it is very interesting how the collective representations of gender roles in Ukrainian society changed in the last 30 years. And here I mean since the time of the proclamation of the independence of Ukraine. And what is the current position of women in Ukrainian military?
Hello to everyone. I'm very glad to be here. And dear Maria, thanks a lot for organizing this event. And to answer your very broad question, I would like to pay attention to the issue of gender equality politics in the Ukrainian society, because when we talk about gender roles, we should take double approach, top down and bottom up. And of course, institutional level, gender politics, they form gender roles. And as you mentioned, it's in Constitution of Ukraine, equal rights and opportunities, of course, they are included. At the same time, I would say that compared to other former Soviet Union countries, Ukraine has one of the best officially developed and institutionalized gender politics. More than 15 years ago, in 2005, we have a particular separate legislation on ensuring of equal rights and opportunities of women and men. And actually, for more than, I would say, 15 years, a lot was done, especially after Orange Revolution by very pro-European President Yushchenko, who signed a lot of decrees and documents on gender equality implementation. And the same when we talk about military. Despite the fact that military sphere is perceived as one of the most patriarchal and who had very strong Soviet legacy, where actually in Soviet times, for men, it was very important to be in the armed forces, to be drafted, and military was one of the most important institutions for constructing adult masculinity. Later, after collapse of Soviet Union, actually armed forces lost its prestige, and as you may know, there were a lot of strategies that men used to skip draft, and one of the strategies actually to enter higher education. At the same time, I would say obligatory draft for men is not perceived as discrimination based on sex in the Ukrainian legislation. And for women, it was not so easy to get some jobs in the military, because for these jobs they needed service in the armed forces. But what we see is that with gender equality politics implementation, also in the security and defense sector, there were some changes. And even in 2006, so more than 15 years ago, it was the position of gender equality advisor of Minister of Defense, later Minister of Internal Affairs. So actually, it was quite long in incremental change, step-by-step approach of gender equality implementation. But of course, the major changes happened after Euromaidan protests. You are absolutely right that actually women were very active participants of different, I would say, spheres and different activities during Euromaidan. And Euromaidan was called as a revolution of dignity. And dignity, human rights became quite important values for the society, and actually civil society became very visible actor after Euromaidan in different spheres, also in military. Because when Russia occupied first Crimea, later part of Donbass, There were a number of volunteers who decided to join armed forces in order to defend the country, and women were quite visible group among them. And actually, for the last 9 years of war, you see that armed forces of Ukraine changed quite a lot, and this values of dignity and professionalism became among major ones for those members of armed forces who do believe in I would say in these values, and who really want better country, better armed forces, and women play quite visible role also in this fights and in this values implementation of dignity and professionalism for the armed forces.
Thank you. So I think we can witness these very drastic changes in Ukrainian society that have been ongoing through the last 20 years, maybe, when we can see and see the changes that are visible on the structural level and also on the level of the worldview, collective representations. And I think that in this context, social and research projects are extremely significant and influential. Together with Maria Berlinska, who heads a volunteer organization Center Air Reconnaissance now, and other colleagues, you launched the Invisible Battalion project in 2015. This project was aimed at advocating for gender equality in the armed forces of Ukraine by researching and documenting the participation of Ukrainian women in the war against the Russian occupation. What were the biggest challenges in your work as an academic coordinator of this project? Which results of your work did you observe? And more broadly, have you traced the direct impact of this project on Ukrainian society? Is it already visible for you, not only as a member of the society, but also as a researcher?
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Before I mentioned more top-down approach, and now I would like to stress on bottom-up or grassroots activism because of this project and later advocacy campaign, Invisible Battalion. It's really grassroots activism driven by, first of all, military women who faced gender discrimination in the armed forces. And you're absolutely right that in summer 2015, so it's already 1 year after anti-terrorist operation, Maria Berlinska, who graduated my university, Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, Department of History, and who's been organizing air reconnaissance classes also at our university, she approached me and asked for help to do sociological study about gender discrimination of women in the armed forces. And she by herself was a very interesting case study, because Maria was doing air reconnaissance, and we do understand now that drones are very important for the for armed forces, but this list of combat military profession, air reconnaissance, was not allowed officially for women in military. So Maria doing this, in fact, couldn't be recognized by a state, and she was volunteer, but at other women who's been doing other combat work. For example, they've been snipers, doing military, driving military vehicles, etc. They were not visible for military and state as those who are involved in this combat positions. And so we also, together with other graduates of Department of Sociology of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, Anna Kvit, Anna Gritsenko, we did sociological study that that was named metaphorically Invisible Battalion. It was actually about approximately 1,000 that for the first year of war they've been in military and combat positions, but actually majority of them were absolutely not visible for the state, because some of them they've been officially registered for more traditionally female works, like for example cooks or doing bookkeeping. And so there were also some other problems that women faced, like some of them they are still an issue now, lack of uniform, in the armed forces for women. It's necessary to have some gender sensitive approach when you talk about military equipment, etc. And we interviewed around more than 40 women anonymously, and also around 10 men, about the perceptions, their attitudes of being in the armed forces during this so-called anti-terrorist operation. We did some expert interviews. We analyzed also media discourse. Actually, it's also very important, to look how images of women in military are portrayed in Ukrainian media. And we presented this study in actually in beginning of winter 2015. It was one of the challenge, of course, because you may imagine that actually most data were not open, and it was not clear about some statistics. It was still, I would say, some Soviet legacies that women are in the armed forces, but mainly in stereotypical female feminized professions, doing some work like the similar that they are doing the labor market, connecting with caring about others, providing some help, some psychological services, whatever. And during presentation we were positively impressed that our respondents, military women, they appeared and they actually were ready, they talk publicly about their problems, and later they were ready to fight for their problems, to come to Ministry of Defense in different protests. And we also actually, in our sociological study, we showed both some successes of gender equality implementation, because as I said, they were we could see that officially Ministry of Defense, they had gender policy, and there were, so percentage of women was quite comparably to other countries, quite high. At the same time, of course, because of this very paternalist approach, a number of professions were not allowed for women. It was very strong horizontal and vertical gender segregation. Military, in gender sociology, we perceive military actually as a part of labor market. And in general, in the labor market, you have this horizontal segregation, traditionally female, traditionally male professions, and also vertical segregation, so-called glass ceiling. But in 2015, there were hardly any women like generals, so on very top positions of decision making. And there were some stereotypes. Women, they were facing, I would say, problems about which we've been reading in history books, because usually history repeats itself, and during other wars, Second World War, women were used by state as a reserve labor force. When there is lack of more traditional labor force like male one, so women are very actively integrated, and you may see that in like Soviet Union, we've been integrating women into military very actively as snipers. There were very famous snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Actually, she's Ukrainian. You could see in Kyiv, in Museum of the Second World War, some of her things. And she's became like also icon of fight of Soviet Union and was taken to US by Soviet army to ask for, to open the second front, and women were strategically used also to show that the whole country is fighting, and in general, it's perceived that women could be quite good snipers, and they are, and also female pilots. So on different professions, women were, but as you could read in Svetlana Alexievich book, this Belarus writer and journalist, and Womanly Face of War. Later, when this women from Red Army, and actually even now it's not clear the number of women in the Red Army. That means that actually it's a problematic issue if you don't know the figures. Later, when they returned, they were ashamed, in their communities, what they've been doing in the war, that they've been coming to find for husbands. They were so-called PPZ, Походная полевая жена. And all this myths and stereotypes. And our respondents, they were also telling that, some of them, they were facing very stereotypical attitudes towards their families, military, in military unions, like what they are doing here, that, their motivation is not patriotic, but more individual one, like to find husbands. But actually in our study, we showed that the motivation of women is also, like as a man, is also patriotic. And in general, women should have the right to die, to defend their country, to die for their country if they want this. So, this history, it looked like the history repeated itself, and we saw these parallels, and even, commemoration politics is also very important, because I remember in my school in Volyn region, in this, when talking about veterans of the Second World War, in this in school walls, you could see mainly men as the veterans who are coming back, and women were among those who were greeting men with flowers. So all this huge numbers, because there are, historians, they are talking about millions of women who were in the Red Army. Mainly of them, they were absolutely, forgotten. They were not properly commemorized. Only some of them, like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, they became like, icons. And so we were inspired also by some, historical books, historical stories. And of course, we didn't want the repetition, a repetition of this story. And And it was very important that our respondents decided to do some changes. And besides sociological study, we also did calendar. And actually, you know, recently there were a number of debates about calendar of the fifth channel. We had in 2016 our Invisible Battalion calendar with military women and citations from our study. And I think it's a very good idea to produce calendars like this. This calendar was not sexualized images of women, but with real military women. This calendar was also shared in different, you know, military units, and it became so this a public sociology project driven by vulnerable groups, military women. It became a larger advocacy campaign with calendar, with documentary Invisible Battalion. There were some protests, a lobby of from different actors, female politicians. They were also lobbying changes in legislation. And actually, it had some successes. At the same time, of course, it was not so easy, firstly, to present this in front of military, because there were some, and always there are military women who would say that they don't feel discrimination, you know, that don't support such perception. But for the next year, in 2016, what we see is that despite some challenges in communication with Ministry of Defense, but because of this, I would say, quite intense pressure from Grassroot, from different actors, also media paid large attention to this topic, there were some changes. And Ministry of Defense opened combat positions like snipers, air reconnaissance, those positions where women were in volunteer battalions and in general in the, you know, in the armed forces for women. And so women could be officially recognized. Step by step, there are some other changes. So not only horizontal, but vertical gender segregation. In 2018, I think it's first woman became general, and currently there are around 3 women. Large changes happened with military education. That is very important also for integration of women into labor market. Military colleges and military universities provide opportunities for women to enter, and the most famous military college named by Ivan Bogun already, you know, so they got some girls, and they already, I think, around 50 girls already graduated from this college and then front line. And also another issue that is very important, it's percentage of women and visibility of women among veterans, because as a result of Russian war in Ukraine since 2014, we have approximately 26,000 female veterans. And there is a women's veterans movement as quite a visible actor. They are fighting for women's, you know, visibility and rights. They do also, you know, they do diplomacy. They've been doing international diplomacy about this war even before invasion, you know, to pay attention to the war. So you could see that after this, for the it's already 8 years past, and we do observe some positive changes. We even managed, so our second study was about the needs of women's veterans. The third study was devoted to the very challenging and problematic topic in all armed forces, sexual harassment and gender-based violence. and our fourth study that is almost ready. It's about women's access to military education. And currently with team, we are doing already fifth Invisible Battalion study where we measure I would say results of changes and find also some gaps for the 8 years that happened after the first study.
Thank you, Tamara. We can see that everything is related to the policies of representation and memory. And in this context, I guess art also plays a remarkable role, because within the project, the Invisible Battalion, there was not only a great advocacy campaign and sociological research, but also several documentaries were created by female directors Irina Tsilik, Svetlana Lishinska, and Alina Horlova. And in these 6 documentaries created by these female directors, they focused on the stories of 6 different Ukrainian women from different regions of Ukraine, different backgrounds, age, and so on, and tried to map the status of women in the Ukrainian military. Knowing the films that were created within the project The Invisible Battalion, how do you think they embody a female perspective on the war? Because as I have already told, these films were created by female directors. Moreover, it is interesting, how do you as a sociologist consider the role of documentary films in transforming the collective outlook? Is cinema an efficient tool of changing gender representations in Ukrainian society? Can we witness that?
Yes, you are absolutely right. Actually, movies are very important, I would say, tools to portray reality. And also in our other study that we did about commemoration and commemorative politics of fallen soldiers in this Russian war, we interviewed Ukrainian society. We gathered public opinion. What do they think are in which forms should be this commemoration? And the first option was chosen, of course, movies. So documentary, fiction movies, and in general, I would say media in a broader perspective plays a very important role for sharing, some images and gender roles. And this documentary was, I would say, also important part of Invisible Battalion advocacy campaign. It tells different 6 stories of very different women and their participation in the war. And actually, I would say later you see that some of this majority actually of these women, they continue fighting even after invasion. Sniper Olena Bilozerska, also Tyra, who is now doing a very big international diplomacy after release from Russian captivity. Andriana, who is actually was on front line and who was injured, unfortunately. So you could see that I would say it's to show diversity of women, as far as also veterans are very. It's a very diverse group, and it's important sometimes also to challenge this very heroic narrative. That is important. At the same time, it's I would say it's very important to talk about problems, and that is why the second documentary was about post-traumatic stress disorder that one of the female veterans was facing. And in general, we understand that after the victory, it will be a very important issue to, to face a number of psychological challenges, trauma, and it's important to talk about this to the needs of veterans and participants of the war. When this documentary was created, I would say the major stories, narratives, they were also like very stereotypical, and women appeared, in media, for example, for International Women's Day, 8th of March, women were mentioned and portrayed, but sometimes it was a bit stress on, beauty as a major role of women, and you see it's a problem because in major stereotypical narrative, beauty is the value that is very sometimes too much underlined. And there is a problem with this because, military women are professionals in their sphere, and it's not appropriate, to talk about beauty or motherhood as two major issues. And we faced some of these problems during our analysis of media. But later, step by step, what you could see now, that women are more mentioned in more diverse roles, more egalitarian, where they shown as professionals, and the media is trying, in news and also in documentaries to make women more visible. There is a fiction movie, Sniper, based on a real story of sniper Mykola Voronin, who is actually also a graduate of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Today is his birthday, actually. And it's his real story. And due to this storyline, you could see there is a group of snipers, not only Mykola, and among them is a woman. And it's very important, that because women are snipers, they are, that, and it's just like normal narrative, nothing exotic or specific. And of course, there are some particular movies also on women. And it's important to show particular stories of women, like a couple of years after invasion, it was this movie produced by Ukraine, and I think Russia also participated, Nezlamna, Unbreakable, or Battle for Sevastopol, about Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko, about sniper born in Ukraine and visited sniper school in Odessa, I think, as far as I remember. So it's important to have particular stories of women. At the same time, I think it shouldn't be, ghettoization, exotization, and in mainstream movies, it's important to have women, like in this sniper movie. Another important issue that women and women's role in war is also mentioned, even in some cartoons. and there is this Ukrainian cartoons about history of Ukraine, Книга Мандрівка Україна, book. Sorry, I'm not sure how to translate it correctly. And there is, I think, the last season is about invasion. And there is particular episode about women, жіноча лють. And also in other episodes about volunteers women are. So I would say that recent tendencies is that women are more and more mentioned. Recently on Berlinale, for example, Nadia Parfan presented movie It's a Date about also Ukrainian military woman. Alisa Kovalenko, who is actually film director and who went to armed forces, also presented movie in Berlinale. So actually you see that women who are producing movies, they entering military, and actually what I explained to international audience, especially in universities, that actually people from civil society, from universities, from culture, they entered armed forces, and the whole country is volunteer, and it's important to explain this also through different movies. But of course we need even more. Yes, because I see that recently we need more TV series, more mainstream movie. Documentaries are very important, but they hardly I think that you will see them in prime time. It's important to see what is shown for wider audience, yes, on TV in prime time. So it should be more fiction and more TV series with also visibility of women in military.
Tamara, I would agree with you, because I think that a very appropriate name for the project, Invisible Battalion, exactly demonstrates that even though we know the particular processes and particular historical facts that are known to maybe a narrow circle of scholars, but are unfortunately unknown to the wider audience, and to transform their consideration of the wider audience of these issues, it is important to make these issues visible. So why not make that through the popular culture too? So I would agree that cinema and film industry now appeals maybe more, I mean, in the last 10 years to these topics, and makes these topics relevant. In your answers today, you addressed a lot Ukrainian history of the last 100 years, especially you referred to the experience of the World War II, but we may also list other traumatic episodes of Ukrainian history of the 20th century that are the defeat of the national liberation struggle in 1920s, Stalinist repressions, artificial famine, Holodomor, then German occupation for sure, then Russian occupation again. And we are now in the point where we struggle to overcome the past and hopefully finally make the cultural transition from a colonized state to an independent country. Although we proclaimed our independence or revived our independence in 1991, we are still struggling for that. As a sociologist, how do you perceive it is possible to overcome the collective traumas that Ukrainian society has, and what is the role of the projects, in particular the Invisible Battalion, how these projects contribute to overcoming the trauma?
Yeah, thanks a lot. You're right, absolutely. When we mention also women, I just want to add that women were active participants of underground UPA, Ukrainian Underground Army, so-called Women of there are some recent also project where there are more life stories of these women, who's been fighting together with Roman Shukhevich and, Stepan Bandera and other more famous men. Yes, and it's very important to know its history. And I would say, as far as I represent not only research, but also education sphere, and I call myself, education activist, I would put very large stress not only on media, but also on education. I do think that we should have, more critical education with, inclusion of different groups, also women in the in this historical narrative, and I hope that it will be lack of this, gender segregation in education and secondary education when we talk about some classes like, military defense, whatever, and it's very important to include this issues also as trauma, to talk about even sometimes not very comfortable topics like, sexual violence and war, and what could we see in this war, that actually sexual violence, rape is used by Russian soldiers as actually genocide of a Ukrainian nation, and that it's also part of war, and how to deconstruct the issue of who are heroes, yes, and that actually small stories and small input is input for your community is also something that matters a lot. And I just think that all these aspects, they are sharing through education, secondary, higher education. And it's very important also to change sometimes very Soviet-style military education that we also see and observe in our news study about women's access to military education, more lifelong education. A couple of years ago, we launched online course for military and all interested people on gender equality and prevention of sexual harassment. And it's important that this course is quite popular, and already, 200,000 people got certificate. So I do think that different, educational projects and activities, they are very important when we talk, on such challenges after rebuilding Ukraine after victory. Yes, and it's important that currently there are already a number of projects that trying to do this, to include, to discuss, but yes, of course, the role of professional, critical, decent education is very important for rebuilding Ukraine after victory and also for reaching justice as for all these crimes that Russia did against Ukraine. Because victory, it's not only the occupation of territories, but it's also, I would say, justice for you know, in all these crimes for international in front of international community. And media education play also important roles in reaching these goals.
Yes, I absolutely agree, and the role of humanities here, I think, is also extremely significant. That can provide the means to cultural critique, to connect different realms, to undermine stereotypes, power narratives, and so on, and contribute to the victory in the meaning, in terms you were talking about, not just the political consequences, but also constructing the idea of national unity, solidarity, justice, social justice, and so on. Tamara, I'm extremely grateful for your time and your sharing the ideas concerning Ukrainian culture, the transformation of Ukrainian society. And I hope that all of things we were discussing here today will be visible in our future development. Thank you.